who all these people are. So I don't know whether, hey? So what's Kempa doing in a games class? So my name is David Kempa. I'm associate chair here. I mostly teach like algorithms, data structures, and related class. But the reason I'm here is, and why Jackie is here, so as a department we're trying to hire a few new lecturers this year, sort of across all areas of computer science. And because Scott is awesome, but there's only one of him and we can't clone him, so since we need more people to keep this program going, so we're looking at a bunch of candidates, and one of them is Jackie, who is here today. And so the idea is that, so she's been here on campus yesterday and today, she gave a guest lecture in a 500 level class yesterday and today here. And basically, for practical purposes, you should pretend that Jackie is Scott, except she looks a little different. And other than that, yeah. So she'll just sort of teach you material that's just as relevant, hopefully, to what you're doing here. And afterwards, Scott will send you an email with a link for a survey where you can give us feedback on what you thought of today's lecture. We take these quite seriously. We want to make sure that you guys have an input in who will be teaching your classes in the future. And so if Jackie gets hired, there's a good chance that some class you'll be taking down the road would be taught by her, so you might consider this a good or a bad thing, and so you should let us know either way. I think it's really important that as students you sort of use your ability to influence how your education is going to pan out. And I think that's all I should say at this point. I'll let Jackie take over.
Okay, thanks, David. So I wanted to have a little fun with this class, but also impart some knowledge to you guys about sort of what I've learned over the years designing immersive virtual environments, because I think we're poised to have a kind of a resurgence in this area with things like the Facebook purchase of Oculus Rift. And I'd like you not to have to go through a lot of the things that we went through back in the late 1980s, that when virtual reality first kind of burst on the scene. So I'm going to kind of go through this in a chronological way, looking at virtual reality that I have made over the years. And of course, this is where the next generation's going. So I think at the end, I'll touch on where I think this could be going, where your role in that might be, and then maybe we can have some discussion to see how these techniques might be involved in sort of the next wave of media that we use as consumers in this world. So just a couple of thoughts that I always keep in my head, and these are just little phrases, that technology always extends us if we do it right. It's not something that limits us, it extends us. And these things that we build are experiences, and these experiences are not abstractions. These are realities. These are part of what we experience as human beings. And we do most of our experiencing as human beings through an embodied persona. So we have these bodies. The bodies really flavor how we think about the world. So even many of our metaphors are all based on the body. You know, we're over that, or we're under the weather, you know, because usually we're laying down when we're sick. So there are so many things that having a body really ties into, and it should tie into technology as well. Where these kinds of experiences we have happen is called place. We have lots of spaces, but it's meaning assigned to a space that makes it into a place. So when I'm designing these things, I always want them to be a place. And then I don't want them to be boring, and I'll talk more about that. And I think we can add things that make these things more directly applicable to us as human beings by adding an emotional component. So this is all part of what I call my immersive design philosophy, and we'll kind of go through how I got there. So my first VR experience was 1989. This is actually a photo from a couple of years later, and you can see that head-mounted displays back then were a little bigger, and this one was the Leap Optics. It was the second version, but it was still so top-heavy that you had to wear this big breastplate as a counterweight so the thing didn't like fall down your face. But it was, you know, it was a $50,000 head mount. We were happy to have it there. The glove is something that we actually built ourselves in this lab that I was working at. I thought this experience was so powerful that I wanted to work in this field. And these were some of the words that were being bandied about of people that put their head in a head-mounted display and had that first kind of religious experience, which is what Mark Zuckerberg had a few weeks ago. Same exact words kind of come to mind. So I went to work at this research lab called the Institute for Simulation and Training in Orlando, Florida. And really I don't remember what I saw in the first VR experience I had. I think it was kind of boring in terms of what it was showing. It was seductive in that I was somewhere else. I didn't know where I was, but I was somewhere else, and that place was kind of boring. But that being able to transport myself somewhere else was really special. And I really wanted to make it even better than it was. Now, in the early days, what I worked on at this research lab was pretty boring stuff. We worked on building walkthroughs. We did stuff with the Army Research Institute that originally looked at your eyesight in a head-mounted display. We actually had eye charts in there, and you were legally blind, basically. You did 2200 was the eye measurements that we came up with. We did color eye charts as well. But what we wanted to look at was whether the military could use these things for training experiences. And they were focused on making them have more photorealistic aspects. So that was the big thing. How can we make these look better? Look better. So it was looking better over the quality of experience, and I really wanted the quality of experience. One of the studies we did was we built the building we were in virtual reality. We either trained people by walking them through the virtual version of it, through the real building, or just showing them photos, and then we gave them a task where they had to go find things on every floor. And it turned out that both the virtual and the physical pre-training were equally valid and far superior to the photo training. So at the same time, I was working on these huge image generators for flight and tank simulators. So these were things where the machines were huge, huge beasts, and totally proprietary code that you would have to go in and figure out how to build and make things with and program the simulation you wanted. And next to that, these fancy new svelte SGI machines we got were pretty amazing. So these were machines that cost between $40,000 and $100,000, and they looked about like that. The image in the lower right corner is from SGI's Performer Town. So it used sort of a scene graph situation called Performer, some code that you could actually get in and program fairly easily. And that was state-of-the-art looking right there. But again, it didn't do much for me to walk around these empty streets. They were just not that cool. So with another person who was working at the institute at that time, a psychology student who had changed to computer science, we decided that we would start making environments that evoked emotional responses. So that was our thing. We were going to see if we could make these kind of low-res, boring simulations really get you to feel something. So that was one of the things that we worked on. We worked on some practical things, other ways that a virtual world could be exciting to a human being, and one was to make it a shared situation where you could build CAD models together being inside the CAD models while you were building them. And then ToyScouts was an after-hours group that took what we had used as test beds for the Army and made full-body immersive games. So these were some fun things that we did, and I'll talk about each of them in a little more detail. So Virtopia was the project I did with the psychology student who later became part of Disney Imagineering and then head of Disney's online games. And he's back with Disney just recently doing some more interesting stuff. So what we did was start with this desert interface, and it was a pretty barren interface, and you could fly over it, and if you came to an oasis with a pond, and you jumped in the pond, it took you to one of 9 different worlds. And those worlds were each designed to evoke a different emotional response. So the one with the blue background over there is Fang City, and Fang City starts out as this really idyllic kind of pastoral landscape with really relaxing music, and then these clocks tear up from the ground and the buildings tear up from the ground, and the sky fractures and starts spinning around in squares above your head, and everything gets cacophonous and just really gets you kind of anxious. And then everything eventually goes back down and the pastoral landscape starts again. So we have that one. The one with the trees was an endless forest, and that endless forest we did some fancy things with the code to just have a small group of trees that we then we kept loading as you got near the edge. So that was a big thing back then. And then we had this wraith that you'll see in the next slide a little bit better. But these were an army of wraiths that you couldn't get near, so you'd go after them. And the forest was endless, but you could never get to these things. And there was a haunting sound, and it was just frustrating and nostalgic all at the same time. The one on the lower right was called the Conversation Room, and that one was probably the most abstract thing we did. So you were popped into this room, and there was this kind of abstracted animation on the wall. We had very low res textures. I'll tell you how low res those textures were. And very limited texture memory, like 8 megs or something, and that was like the big machine. So we ran a very simple animation, just flipping through images on the walls, and then there was a photo album in the middle of the room that if you went up to it, you could turn the pages, and there were conversations embedded in this room. You heard the walla walla of like you were at a cocktail party, but as you went up to each of the walls or you looked at the photos in the book, you would hear one snippet of conversation kind of disassociate itself, like you were eavesdropping on people's talking. And people loved that room. I don't know why. They just absolutely loved that room. Yeah.
Just wanted to interject that Virtopia, designed to evoke emotional responses. This is extremely relevant today because one of our own student games was called Nevermind, and it was designed to evoke emotional responses and has won several awards. It was done by Aaron Reynolds and some other graduates of the program. And so again, I just want to say that this is all stuff that students are trying to do now.
And nobody was trying to do this back then. They all thought we were nuts. I tell you, the Army people were like, what? Just get with the program. And we said no. So here's the little wraith image up there. We did take this to 2 film festivals, 92 and 93, and then to SIGGRAPH in 94. And at this festival, people just lined up. I have pictures of this central area where we ran it with lines that were knee deep. This was one particular visitor who was looking at things, and you could see the expression, and then he comes out and he's like, yeah. Well, one of the experiences that I didn't talk about was one that we were particularly proud of, and this was one where you were popped into the spider's lair. And this was a 30-foot high spider, so when you had the head mount on and you were up close to this spider, he was pretty scary. But he wasn't scary enough, so what we did was we had the spider have 8 states, everything from wait, to ignore, to be interested, to stalk, to attack, to kill. So we had these states, and it was kind of random. We did it so you couldn't do the same thing every time and get the same state. So sometimes you might advance and the spider might run away, and sometimes you might advance and he might attack you. But what we did was to increase the emotional response, we tied it to a recorded heartbeat. So each of those states had a different heart rate to them. So if he was ignoring you, the heartbeat was pretty slow. But if he was attacking you, it got really, really fast. Now, there were some people who had problems getting in a head mount with a spider, and we had people rip head mounts off and run away. But I think a lot of it was this entrainment that we put in. So that heartbeat your heartbeat tended to entrain with the heartbeat. That means it matched it. That means you got really upset when the heartbeat was fast, and people got really scared. This was long before they did the spider phobia thing at University of Washington, which came around a couple years later. But we were particularly proud of this spider thing because most people couldn't stand being in it. Okay, so the next thing that we were doing, and this was actually a funded project called Polyshop, and Polyshop was a very practical application. We were trying to see if you could use this virtual reality thing to build something from the inside. So you had the head mount on, you sat at a desk, so you actually had something physical that you could feel. And you put your hands in a certain spot and it aligned the desk to what you were seeing in the virtual world. You could see your hand. The picture, and we have very few pictures from this time. It was so hard to take pictures. But on the left is the menu bar. So as you're sitting at this desk, through the head-mounted display, you're seeing all of these menu bars with the 3D objects on them, whether they're textures or whether they're desks or doors or whatever, and you could touch the arrow and scroll through about 100 objects we had there. To pick it up, you picked it up with, we had made these pinch gloves. You picked it up with a pinch glove and you put it in the middle and you could arrange things. So you could make a room, you could make whatever. And it was really intuitive. It was so intuitive that one of the researchers brought their 4-year-old daughter in one day, and we put the head mount on her and showed her this, and she was like, ooh, blocks. And she actually picked up a couple things from the menu bar. She got up out of the chair and sat on the floor and put them on the floor. And we went, okay, you know, it's pretty intuitive if a 4-year-old gets it. So that was a fun project. You know, we did a lot of not so fun projects, but this was the most fun. So we had all of these test beds the Army had paid for and all of these big SGI machines, and we had some head-mounted displays, and we made these pinch gloves. The guy doing his master's degree actually made these pinch gloves and sat there and sewed them right next to me, and got a PhD, got a master's from it. They were then picked up by a small company called Multigen and sold through Multigen and through Fake Space Labs. But what we encouraged the students to do was to use this immersion for fun and make these full-body immersive games. So there were a number of them. One was called Cyber Surfing, and that's me up in the corner in the left. Without the head mount, I was just doing it with a monitor, but you could do it with the head mount too. The first one we ever did was called Noseball. So you have that big head mount on, and your face was a paddle in a breakout game. So you had to keep doing this and get the ball and break out the squares on the screen, and people got really sweaty, and we had to clean this head mount all the time. So it was quite a workout, as was Cyber Surfing. There were a number of other ones that we did. There was a crazy game where you were on a bed of squares, but they would change, and the rules would change halfway through the game of what you could step on and what you couldn't step on, and that was another really crazy one. And of course the students wanted to do a shooter game. You know, we're talking days of Quake and Doom, you know, back then. And I wouldn't let them do anything that was human. You couldn't shoot anything that was human. They had to find something that nobody cared if you shot it. Everybody would enjoy it. And so what they picked was the Energizer Bunny. Because it was such an annoying commercial at the time. So we would show this to entertainment people from Universal theme parks and Disney theme parks, and really tried to get them interested in bringing this stuff to the parks. And this was before Disney got involved with the Imagineering got involved with virtual reality, because that happened after my colleague Mike graduated and went over to them. And they did the carpet ride and some other things. But they couldn't make any money with it either. But we had a heck of a time. This was Friday nights. We'd start around 6. We'd work till about 3 in the morning. We had a bunch of high school students. They came in, they learned to program in C, they learned to do all this stuff just on their own, and then they got to present these things to these entertainment industry professionals, and then at SIGGRAPH and at the film festival. And so it was a great time. So to get this kind of quality experience, there are many ways to do it. You get them engaged. Well, how do you get them engaged? You make them enjoy it, or you provide some agency through interaction, or you give them a story, or you give them emotions. There are so many ways that you can do this. So to make these experiences memorable, you need to make them meaningful. And what we looked at in the next thing that I made was how do you take what you've got, which probably isn't going to be super photoreal because it can't keep up in real time, and it probably isn't going to have a lot of audio realism. Can we make it feel real? It doesn't have to be photoreal, it just has to feel real. So we call that cognitive realism. And then providing this kind of very memorable experience and looking at multi-sensory inputs and really intelligent psychological design. So looking at all the tricks we know about what works and what affects you as a human being and putting that in there and forming this emotional connection. Okay? And what's really hard about it is if you're in a VR experience, that person typically has free will. It's not a game where they've got to do these steps and level up and find this thing and then reach this goal. When you build these things, people are walking around in them and they can go anywhere. They can do anything. So how do you get them to do what you want without letting them know you're kind of leading them? So this was a concept that we called a cohesive experience, and another part of it was coercive narrative, and I'll talk about those. But it's organizing these events into some kind of structure that the participant feels they have agency and they can see that what they're doing has an effect that moves them through a story or an experience. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to talk about is the first project I did at the Institute for Creative Technologies. I was there from the very beginning until last year, and they asked me what I wanted to do, and I said multisensory, highly immersive, cognitively real virtual reality environments. And they said go. So I started this sensory environments evaluation project, and I ran it for about 4 years. Had a really cool team, several of whom are over at the cinema school right now. And we wanted to use all kinds of sensory inputs. Some of them really weren't available then. So some of the things we thought were our palette to work with time, the sounds, of course, especially if we could spatialize those sounds, put them in the right place in space. Smells, things that could attract the eye, like movements, specific objects that might attract your eye and lead you in a particular direction. Different kinds of interaction techniques. Characters, both non-intelligent and intelligent agents. If you could put somebody else in there, that's a big coercive element, putting someone else in a networked environment. We didn't do that on this particular one. And then really looking at things that may seem pretty normal to you guys, playing the kinds of games that you can play now, but this was back when there weren't games like that, but having all these corroborative details, and I'll talk more about that. Right now I'm going to play a little video of it, and then I'll talk about some of the things that I might talk over this a little bit. Oh no, this one I can't. This one that we'll hear some of these techniques.
Over the past 20 years, the majority of virtual environments have been designed with the controlled isolation of the different sensory inputs, such as sight, sound, and smell. Photorealism in particular has commanded the greatest amount of attention in the design of realistic virtual environments. What we set out to investigate in our research, however, was how these different sensory inputs affect one another. At the University of Southern California's Institute for Creative Technologies, we are developing a series of virtual environments for training, art, and education that utilize multiple sensory inputs to heighten the feeling of presence in the virtual worlds. Our Sensory Environments Evaluation Project, or SEE, looks at how to maximize the relationships between sensory inputs by considering their effects during the initial design process. Our prototype environment for this design approach is DarkCon, a scenario in which the participant is asked to make his or her way through an unfamiliar hostile environment at night without being discovered. While there, the participant is also tasked with making a number of observations whose accuracy will be the gauge by which their success or failure is measured. SEE currently employs real-time delivery hardware capable of textured graphics, spatialized sounds, infrasound, and low-level haptics, and is in development of a proprietary scent delivery technology. For the design process, we describe the environment in terms of sensory inputs and filter according to scenario parameters, expected degree of emotional response, and available technology. A number of these elements, such as ambient sounds, smells, secondary objects, and detailed textures, might seem incidental, but provide what we call corroborative detail. Their inclusion is essential toward providing believability. These elements are then woven into the story, compressing the scenario down to its essential events. Such interactive narrative is challenged by the participant's free will within the virtual space. He or she can go anywhere and do anything. To ensure a meaningful experience where specific goals are met while still providing this sense of free will, C utilizes a number of techniques we collectively term coercive narrative. We construct psychological and sensory cues that seem native to the scenario, but which persuade the participant to take the desired course of action. These include sounds, sights, and smells that attract or deter the participant's movement. We also create a corresponding emotional score using low-level frequencies designed to make the experience persistently engaging. This score helps guide the participant's emotional states within the scene. The evaluation component of the C project will correlate pre- and post-experience questionnaire information with real-time participant data retrieved from physiological monitors. Our studies will help us determine the most effective sensory components necessary to create a high degree of presence, and the effect that that presence will have on the potential uses of virtual reality.
That was a long time ago. And we didn't have nearly the tools that you guys have to make games back then. So, but we did take a lot of our ideas from things like Disney's animation principles. So I remember sitting there talking to my team saying, nothing's going to be static in this world. You're never going to come to something and it's just going to be sitting there. There's going to be trees moving, there's going to be, crunches under your feet, there's going to be things in the landscape. We had to move the moon according to the amount of time you were in there. The clouds were all moving. All of these things that were not usually done in these immersive virtual environments. And we wanted these multiple sensory aspects. We wanted it to feel real. We wanted it to be cognitive real. And because we were being funded by the Army, we made it a sort of a de facto military thing, but we didn't want shooting because shooting is a fairly high-powered agency thing. It really engages you because you're trying to find something, you're trying to shoot it, you're trying to aim at it. We didn't want that, so we made it an observational task. So you were told that you were being dropped into an area of Bosnia that either paramilitary activity was happening or refugees were kind of inhabiting. And you'll hear more about that in a little bit. And your goal was to determine from the clues that you saw which one it was. Is it paramilitary forces or is it just refugees? Is it danger to us? Is it not? And then if it was dangerous, you were supposed to drop a GPS locator device near what looked like the headquarters to you. So it was kind of dangerous. You had to sneak in, and it was almost impossible to drop that thing without being found out. So the end of this thing was always kind of a heart-wrenching thing for people. We researched this a lot. We got all kinds of, hello? Yeah, thanks, I don't need updates. Sorry about that. Helpful systems. We made it look like areas of Bosnia. We knew exactly on the map where we were going, and we knew that things would be fairly realistic. We made it into a storyboard. We also did things like watch movies. So we watched films like Dark City and the 13th Floor to kind of look at this virtual reality kind of idea. We looked at things like The Third Man, which is an old film, and Hitchcock movies like Vertigo and Alien to see how to create suspense. The Third Man takes place in the sewers of Vienna, so we were doing this culvert system, and we wanted to have a lot of that atmosphere of those Vienna sewers in this. And we did field trips to Disney, and we even thought of little things like what would a refugee drop? They might drop their photo album. This would be clues that the refugees were there. This doll, if you got close to it, it had a voice box and it would squeak. It was kind of creepy, but one of those startle things that you would encounter as you had to go through this culvert. So you're dropped at the end of a culvert, and you had to find your way through the culvert to the area of interest, and then see what you thought was there. We even went to places like caves to see what the atmosphere was like in a cave, which was about the closest we could get to a culvert, because there was nothing you could stand up and walk around in the LA area. And then we looked at things that, tricks to make the graphics better, because even though this was a big SGI machine at the time, we really didn't have a lot of good graphics tools. So we had to use a number of tricks, like there are no reflections. We had no reflections. And we used a lot of vertex shaders to make things look better than they were, and transparent overlays, and things we could get away with in the, I think at that time we had 16 megs of texture memory. And then to correlate those with the sounds, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. You see reflections, but the reflections are all repeated geometry upside down under the transparent water. So Kurosh Valanajak did that for this, and came up with a lot of techniques to make things look much more realistic than anything anybody else was doing. We wanted to have scents, because scents are one of our most emotional senses. They go directly to your limbic system before your cognitive centers can even act on them. So I had brought in some scent devices of the time for the opening of ICT. We had a little mission rehearsal exercise that we were showing for the grand opening, and I got these, $15,000 scent devices from a company. Got 2 scents because they were as big as this, and they had a big thing that went into there and was fanned out to fill the room with the scent. And the scents I got were diesel exhaust and musty town smell after a rain. And the researchers went, "You're not showing those during the opening demo, because they'll equate our research with bad smells. Not happening." And I went, okay, then I'll invent something that doesn't stick around. So I came up with this idea for a collar that you would wear that would have small cartridges that could be Bluetooth activated, so that a little tiny fan would kind of blow a small amount of, not even the scent liquid. It would just let the molecules waft up, and then those molecules would be blown at your nose. So nobody else around you smelled it. You smelled it. It didn't stink up the room. We built it and we used it, and that was the first version of it there that person's wearing. And then we had great smells like bat guano. So where you see the bats hanging from the ceiling, you smelled bat guano. And you know what? Everybody liked it. It didn't make them think badly of our work, but it didn't stick around forever. Then we used the 3D spatialized sound, and we worked with a system that was created by Chris Kyriakakis in engineering here, that was a 10.2 sound system. And what it gave you was the height information. You could actually tell the difference between something that was like a concert played in a cathedral with and without the height information. But it was all pre-rendered sound. So I got a couple of smart students, and they actually made it into real-time spatialized sound. So here we had this great sound system, and it was triggered by your movements through the virtual world. And we showed this in this VR theater that they had at ICT at the time. Really, we used the screen just for the audiences to see what the person was seeing in the head-mounted display. So the sound was actually right for the person in the head mount, not for the people in the audience. And people would say stuff about that. Now, you can also see some little speakers under the floor, and I'll talk about those in a minute. But, for this sound, we did all kinds of work to get ambient sound. This was our homegrown Foley stage. That's me walking in mud because every kind of material that you walked on made a different sound as you had your footsteps. So the floor, I called it the Infrasound floor. We put 10 subsonic transducers under the. We played at frequencies of 4 to 20 hertz, so you couldn't hear them, but you could feel them. And you could hear them if you turned up the decibel level high enough. But we never did that, because that is where all the research in infrasound as a potentially harmful environmental noise comes from. It's when you are near some, huge machines that produce this infrasound, and it's so loud that it starts to really have a detrimental effect on you. So we never played them that loud, so people were not aware of them. And we blew out a lot of amplifiers trying to find one that would handle the 4 to 20 hertz. It was not a typical thing. And so we got an engineering company in town to work with us on that. And we actually scored an emotional score that when these sounds were playing, you felt unease. And when they went away, you were much happier. So as long as you were in that culvert, you had these infrasounds affecting you. And when you came out of the culvert, you didn't.
One note I also want to bring on is that the research that she's putting into the environments, making them immersive, Orson Welles' Third Man and all these other great films, is what some of the people have been working on in the games program with, again, Oculus Rift, that's just been posted, called Zombies on the Holodeck.
Mm-hmm.
They studied a lot of those great old kind of, movies from the 50s, kind of monster movies, and they captured the tone pretty well. And that's one of the great things about these environments is, as you say, you can get immersed without needing infinite levels of detail, as long as you cover most of the senses, which is kind of what we're going into now, is these completely immersive games.
And you orchestrate them so that they interact effectively and become more than the sum of their parts.
Right.
So yeah, I just saw that zombies one, and somebody would say, "You've got all of these sort of what's the word I want? These trite things in there, like bats and rats and it's but those work because we always have the same reaction to them.
Yeah.
So they may be sort of trite, but we have somebody comes up in your face and screams, you're going to have a reaction that we know how to predict, so you can use that. So again, the feels real visuals, even though we didn't have very good graphics. The 3D spatialized sound, which was pretty amazing. We had both ambient, lots of sounds in the entire world, plus the immediacy of your feet. So even though you weren't really walking all the time, it felt like you were walking because you were hearing the feet appropriate for the materials that you were walking on. The smell, the emotional score, or what I can call passive haptics, and scaffolding and fit, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. But right now I'm going to play you a clip of the DarkCon scenarios. This is one person's walkthrough, so you can just kind of see it. We're starting halfway down the culvert, and I thought this had sound, but so it doesn't. I'll walk over. We had machines in here that were kind of low rumbles, and there were flickering red lights from things that weren't working quite right. We had the rats if you happened to go down the wrong corridor. We had the bats. The bats, when they flew off, told you how to get out because they went in the direction that you figured they were going out. So you would follow them. Then you come out here and everything smells fresh and you're on the riverbank. But this thing comes overhead, so you got to kind of duck back in. While this thing's going overhead, and actually while you're going through the culvert, there are trucks going overhead, and they're knocking rocks off that are falling down and making noise. So there was a lot of little details like that. So now, here you are, you can go anywhere you want. Where are you going to go? Well, you might think it's dangerous, so we put one place you could hide. So of course everybody had to go to this car, because there was no other place in the whole environment that you could actually kind of get a viewpoint without being seen. Now, here's, you've had some clues in the culvert, like the photo albums and the water bottles and things, and so you know that there might have been refugees, but there's some activity going on at that building over there, and here comes a Jeep with some stuff in it, and where are they going? They're going to that building. There's think we should see it, but there's a guard up on the roof who's supposed to be keeping tabs on things, but you have to wait till he lays back and falls asleep before you run up here. And now you're hearing a radio that's in this abandoned building. Wow, was that the end of it? I didn't get the entire thing. You go up and you kind of look to see what's going on with that welder. You can tell he's working on a military vehicle of some kind, but if you get too close, he whips off his hat and runs in the building, and then you hear all this screaming and shouting, and then this dog comes after you, and you hear the chains, and you hear the snarling right in your ear, and you come to a very bad end in that one. There were 3 ways to get a bad end. If you didn't go to the car and you went kind of off into other places, there were landmines all over. So those would get you. If you went up the hill to the village, somebody would see you and come, you'd hear them screaming in Bosnian, and they'd come out and you'd hear the gunshots, and then your whole world went red and turned sideways. It was kind of fun. Not many people got up there. So we realized there was more we could do, because these people were going into this thing, and we really wanted them to behave in particular ways, but to feel like they had agency. So we started with some priming and some filming elements. We wanted to not sit somebody down for these experiments and say, here's what you got to do. You've got to go see if there's paramilitary forces or there's refugees there, and if you think it looks dangerous, drop this device. We wanted that to be part of the experience. So didn't know much about cutscenes back then, but this is kind of like that. We did other things to prime them. So when we did the actual studies, we primed some people to think they were going into a video game, and some people to think they were going into a military mission. And that extended to the point where when we brought them in to do their questionnaires, we either had military posters up or we had game posters up. They were all, we had little briefing things that kind of made them think it was a game, or it was an actual opportunity to do kind of a military training mission. But what we did when you were dropped into the culvert area, at the end of the culvert, the only place you could go was forward, we wanted them to remember what they might have heard in a military briefing. So rather than make them sit and watch a military briefing, we gave them a memory of the briefing. And that's what I'm going to show you next. This is what we call the memory briefing. It happens when you first get into the DarkCon tunnel, and I'm hoping this is a good version of it. Or this is the DarkCon clip again. Okay, so this is not the one I wanted to show you. Did I go backwards? Maybe that's what I did. Memory briefing. Okay.
Over the past 7 days, weapons have been taken from 2 cantonment areas in our AOR. These include BOV-30 mobile and man-portable SA-16 AAA systems.
This is a memory.
Now, Brigade 2 believes they're being stockpiled by local paramilitary forces 11 kilometers northeast of Bonnie Lucan. Here, at the end of the mile west. Whiskey Sierra 164-80699. Our mission? To surveil the port, enemy troops strength, both in the target area and along the main avenues of approach here. We'll report movement, number, type of vehicle. Our PIR is getting an exact and fixed confirmation on the location of those BOV stands. Brigade also wants a clear picture of what type of combo these guys are using. Number and time. Listen up! Team Swahilo into LZ Rainbow with Whiskey Sierra 1755061. Alternate LZ Thunder. Whiskey Sierra 207-50597. The infiltration routes, 4 checkpoints, be on your maps. Be advised, anti-personnel mines are a significant threat all along the secondary roads in the objective area.
See, we're telling you about the
Want to know
landmines.
Here, Whiskey Sierra 174-30761. Now, the atmospheric conditions around here, fog from the river, obstructions, whatnot, can make it real difficult to see our PI. Stay back there 2 miles from the target. Stay back there 2 miles from the target. Take pictures and call right right in there, fall right in there. Counting nose hairs, folks. Counting nose hairs, folks. Counting nose hairs. Good luck. Good luck.
So what this was designed to do is a couple of things. Give you the briefing, right, what you were supposed to be looking for, but also to set the tone of what was going on in that area. So the fact that kids were having guns and shooting out windows and that refugees were being loaded on trains. There were a number of things that you could see there. The water bottles that were in some of those scenes with the refugees are actually the water bottles that appear in the culvert when you go through it. The picture of the woman is one of the pictures in the photo album. So there was just a lot of this corroborative detail. So those corroborative detail is things that give you more information about an environment than what you directly see. So they're evidence of temporal change or things that should be important to you. And sometimes you can do them by putting them in the environment, like the photo album having been dropped and the shoe and whatever. And sometimes you have to present them different ways, like we did in this memory briefing. And then coercive narrative in a free will situation is a way to attract or deter people to go a particular way or to look a particular way. And that's as simple as a bright light. You're going to look at the bright light, or these bats that you startle when you go under them and they fly out. Then you go, oh, that's the way I can go. So these help guide this experience that you're trying to craft without letting them know you're crafting it for them. And then we came up with a way to kind of codify this into a principle for what we were doing for the C project. And so if this is our experience space, and the palette we have to work with is sight, sound, and smell, we can combine this in 1,000 different ways, right? We have another thing, which is time. So time, before they get into the experience, is actual time. But you can play with the time in the virtual experience. It's totally at your prerogative to mess with time in a virtual experience. And then when they come out, they're back on actual time. Okay? This is to represent the free will path that they're going to take through this thing. So it's just totally an idea that they're not going to go from A to B. They're going to wander. They might do some other things. How do you make them go? If this is exactly the way I want them to go, how do I do that? Well, we prime them at first. So like I told you, we had the game posters with serious posters. We had the memory briefing. We had a number of things that we used to prime them. And people are now starting to talk about how do you prime people before they get into, especially a training situation. Then we have, so let's see, experience-based priming, we're getting in there. The corroborative detail is everywhere. So this is just a diagram to just say corroborative detail, let's plop it in wherever we can. So wherever they look, there's something that adds to the feeling that they are in that space, that particular space, at that particular time for this particular purpose. Then coercive narrative has attractors and detractors. So that's why when you look at the loop of this particular path, it goes up where there's a plus sign and then it goes away from the minus signs, and this is a way to get people to go where you want them to go. And then we put in what we called emotional hotspots. And that might be like the bats flying off because it absolutely startles you, and you can use that startle response that we humans have to great effect. It might be when you're in the culvert and the trucks are going overhead and the rocks are falling, then we might have popped up the infrasound so that you felt really uneasy because you wouldn't know what some of these sounds were. We had that mysterious machine that was blinking red in the back. So we had these emotional hotspots where we designed them, and then this is kind of to show that the path through this now is informed by all of these things that we're doing, including that emotional score. And then we tested it. So we tested it at the ICT and we took it to Fort Benning. So these are 2 soldiers that are in it. And we created these tools where you could actually play back the entire experience. So you could watch someone's physiological signals, their heart rate, their skin conductance, and tie it to an exact moment in their particular walkthrough. And what we found was that everywhere we designed that intense emotional response, we got it. So we thought this was great stuff. We published a bunch of papers, we invented scent color, we invented an infrasound floor, we tested a lot of people. It was a great 4-year ride that the Army did nothing with. But I think there's a lot of lessons there for games. And I decided to go and get a PhD with this information that I had kind of gained from that project, because it had not really been codified from a design perspective into something somebody could read and go, yeah, that would work for what I want to do. So I did that. The entire thesis is online if you want to get it. That's the URL, and this is what it looks like. You have to click on one of those things and it'll download the first volume, which is about 300 pages of writing and references, plus a list of every immersive virtual world that was done for more artistic purposes in the first 15 years of VR. Very extensive chart. And then some of my art, which you're going to see here. So as part of the PhD, I wanted to build these emotional environments, and my motivation was that my artwork for years had been about evoking emotional response. And I was an artist before I was a computer scientist. Now I think they merged together very well for me. And this was an environment I made early on that I showed as stereo pairs. So I would render 2 versions of what I built in Alias at the time, and you would look at them in a gallery setting through stereo slide viewers. So I wanted to do one that you could look at, that was more artistic, that you would look at through a head-mounted display, and this is a one-of-a-kind head-mounted display that Fake Space made that never really stayed on your head great, but it had 90-degree field of view. So this was pretty cool back then. And since a couple people trying to go through this environment, we didn't have the theater for that. But the idea was to have these memory stairs where every time you took a step on the stair, you went through a different part of a life experience from before birth to near death. And this is, I actually built this and said, this is what I want built, and they came back and said $50,000, and I said, okay, we'll do it without the stairs, because I wanted to do it in my lifetime. But we did four of these chronological experiences. The project was called the Memory Stairs, so it's part of the PhD work. The first one was before birth, so it was called the embryonic chamber, and everything was, all the sounds were filtered through water, and you would see things like somebody touching, and you would see an argument, and you would see your mother. So there's all kinds of really interesting things. You didn't have much agency in this because you were trapped in a watery chamber. But it was interesting. And then the next one was Just New, where you were in a crib, so your entire viewpoint was from the crib, and these giant faces would come in and out, and you'd smell your mother's perfume, and you'd smell baby powder. So there was, again, a lot of people said this took them way back and brought up memories that they never would have thought they could have remembered. So that was interesting for me because I wanted it to evoke memories. There was another environment in this scare thing called the Forgotten Rooms. There were 2 rooms. You couldn't get out of them once you got into them. And I'll show you a little bit about walking through this room. And there was smells from the fireplace. There were smells from some other things. I mean, we even have fingerprints on the bookcase glass. So there's just all kinds of details that you wouldn't really even notice, but somehow I think if they're not there, you miss them. So we put them in, and they really, fingerprints on the glass doesn't really cost you much. Everything was researched to be correct for the time. The last one was kind of a before-death thing where you were in this giant ocean and things were floating and you were floating and the music crescendoed and you went towards the light kind of thing. So that one was kind of not my favorite, but I'm going to show you a little bit of someone walking through a part of the memory stairs just so you get an idea of it. And this is focused on a video that I did that it plays on that 1930s TV in that room. And there are ghosts of memories that appear as you walk around the room. You'll probably see some of those in here. But all, original music that we did. Anyway, it was fun. And so this is 2004 or 5, somewhere around there. realizing this is a very early one, it doesn't even have all the objects in the dining room. There's no straight chair in here. Not one chair is straight. Because I bet at home you don't have all straight chairs. Your table. So actually, that's supposed to, before you come up to the TV, you see a test pattern, like you would see on old TVs way back then, and it would only start when you came up to it. Before that, you would just hear this sound of a ticking clock, which was slowed down by about 30%. So it was really kind of nerve-wracking to hear it. And then as you went up to different things, you would see these ghosts. So the kind of, I'm getting near the end here, and I want to say that I did all these immersive experiences, but it doesn't always have to be about being fully immersed with a head-mounted display. So when I took this over to London, where I was getting my PhD, I couldn't take the machines from ICT. They just wouldn't let me take them, and I wasn't going to pay for them. So I had to come up with another way to kind of give them the flavor of what was, that immersive experience was like. So I came up with the idea of getting 10-foot by 5-foot silk panels and rigging them from the ceiling of a little production studio there. And then I recorded a walkthrough, and then I rear projected it onto these silk panels and put a fan back there so they moved really slowly. And I had the middle one go out of sync, so even if you stayed there for a while, you would have a different experience every time. So let's see if I can show you a little bit about what that experience looked like. And I don't have really good videos of this, but you would stand in front of these screens, and you would see things. Like I said, the center one would go out of sync, and they would take you through all 4 experiences. And some people who had tried both actually said they really liked being in this sort of sensuous silk panel one better. And the reason I bring this particular thing up is because I think we have people that are really attuned to having immersive experiences, but it doesn't always have to be about the equipment. It can be about the way you present it to someone, and it can be presented in many ways. So you have this sort of what they're calling transvergence, or the transmedia idea, where you can present the similar ideas in many different ways, and have people immersed in ways where they get maybe a different perspective from the different types of immersion. So what I want to kind of leave you with is the final thoughts I have. How do you build it so that each person that goes in there has something that really is meaningful to them? Every person that goes into an immersive design completes that experience on their own. So every person is going to have a different kind of experience based on what they bring to it. They inhabit those spaces viscerally. This is the coolest thing about immersive stuff. This is what gives everybody that initial religious conversion. And if they can find meaning or connection to this experience, then they are going to make that space that you've given them into a place. They're essentially going to form memories. So what's the future of immersive VR? Well, you guys are going to invent it, right? So is it going to be our mass media in the coming decades? Is it going to be a new kind of reality TV, or maybe a virtual vacation channel that we can go to? Are we going to have experiential music? I can think of just a few things. So we're going to have applications that are good for health and well-being, pure entertainment, games, stories that you live in, all of these and more. No one's watching broadcast TV anymore. We're all looking for these other kinds of experiences. And if they have meaning, all the better. So, like this series of books by Tad William on Otherland talks about immersive things where you go and live in the Lord of the Rings. You go and live in these stories. You are one of the people that are the main characters in them. And in some of his books, you've spent kids have spent their entire life not playing Pokemon or whatever. They are living in Lord of the Rings type of situations. I could see that being a possibility. Now, this just came out yesterday where Sir David Attenborough's newest wildlife movie is going to be put in a VR headset. So how cool is that? I have friends that have a big dome thing that they've been putting immersive experiences in for years, and they've been able to take all their dome stuff and put it in the Oculus Rift. So this is what's going to be happening, and there are going to be issues that arise. So Sherry Turkle wrote a book called Being Alone Together, I think is the name of it, or Alone Together, about how all of our social media is keeping us separate. I don't really believe that. But if we're going to be immersed in something that does separate us, where is that human connection? How do we get past that issue? Do we experience all our media alone, or do we find ways to experience it together even though we are immersed and separated from the physical reality? So those are questions you guys are going to have to answer because you're going to invent the future. Thanks.
And just as a note, I love the Bradbury and Velt reference there.
That was on the announcement from the Attenboroughs that said the Velt. Do you all know the Velt story? 1951, Ray Bradbury. It was part of the Illustrated Man. So there's the parents have the greatest, latest multimedia room, and they put it in their kids' room, and the kids start going in it. The wall kind of dissolves, and they can go out in the African veldt, and then they decide they're just going to stay there, and the parents go and get eaten by lions. It's pretty
Spoiler. But it's a very it's a good cautionary tale about a dystopian future in a way. But the truth is that we are not here as a games program to simply try and recreate the latest commercial game. We are in no way a commercial studio. What we are is we're doing all the things that the commercial studios can't invest in. These kind of defining the limits of what constitutes games. And we're perched at a time when people are more and more inured to and used to and ready to accept multimedia input. I grew up again in the 80s, and there was always these stabs at VR, and now we actually have, we've got 3 or 4 members teams in this very room where they're working on a game in the Oculus Rift. And Nevermind was our big hit before that, and this is happening. So it's a great way to realize that when you pitch your games in Final Games, when you guys come around, do so knowing that you can take a stab at pushing the boundaries of what constitutes an experience. And don't try to simply shortchange yourself by saying, here's what a video game is that I grew up with, I want to emulate it. Because we really encourage the kind of why not that you don't get when you have to go out in the workplace. So keep in mind it's a place for innovation within this program, absolutely. This stuff fascinates me because there's no one definition of immersion and no one definition of what constitutes an experience. And we are here to actually define it. #1 game school, 5 years running. So very inspirational to hear the kind of knocking down the limits of what you can do while you're in this program. And I love to remind people of that. Any questions? I have one. What in this, in your experiences, was something that really surprised you, that connected people in the world? Was it the addition of sound? Was it the addition of the smells, as you mentioned? Is there a way to quantify immersion, like the level to which you get into the game?
I think it's a subjective feeling, so it's very difficult to quantify. And there have been attempts over the last 25 years to quantify immersion or presence or whatever. And first thing somebody said to me at ICT was, you have to come up with the equation. X amount of sight plus B amount of sound plus C amount of smell plus equals perfect presence. And I went, no, you're absolutely crazy. How could you do that? Because it's context dependent, and that context is how it relates to you, or how it relates to you, or how it relates to you. you can't do a one size fits all. You just can't. You throw it out there and people are gonna react to it in different ways. So I don't think there's a way to quantify it. There is a list of parameters that have been proposed by military researchers as to how to quantify presence, and I look at it and there's like 27 of them, and none of them talk about the human dimension. Yeah, so it's like, you're missing something there. Nobody talks about the emotion or the sort of subjective response you have to it. It's all, they're trying to quantify it, and we're messy. Humans are messy. We can't always do that, and especially our reactions are messy. So, just, you might like a particular game, and somebody else might hate that game. That's because you're an individual, and you have your own likes and needs and desires and feelings, and so I don't think you can really do that. I think you need to have a range of things that you put out there. People will come and find what works for them. And then I'm a firm believer in that saying, the street finds its own uses for things, so heaven knows what we're gonna find as uses for this immersive technology in round two, what I'm calling round two. It could be stuff that we can't even imagine.
Yeah, and you get emergent gameplay in a way. Emergent gameplay is when you realize your players are using your world and or your game for uses other than what you designed it for. So if you give the blocks and you're supposed to be at a table, and a youngling picks them up and goes and sits on the floor and puts them there,
Then you go,
of course. Exactly. Yeah. That's again one of the great things about this is that they did these statistical research with analytics when they were testing out World of Warcraft, about what people wanted to do, where they wanted to go, and then you get into your Bartell's quadrants of what kind of person plays the game, etc. And really, this is a great arena for emergent gameplay because, again, growing up as I did with an arcade and a joystick and a machine, and you put your quarter in, it's now no arcade machine, it's no quarter, it's you're in the world. What do you want to do? And that's just amazing.
and how do you help people know what their options are in there without, giving them a little thing that says, now you can press this, or you can press that, or you can go here. That coercive narrative, maybe that's got a place in some thinking in the future. One thing that I really wish I had done is been able to take some of those things and make them multiplayer. So I never did that. So I never got to test any of this stuff out where you have more than one person in there. And I think that would be my next dream, is to be able to do that and to see what we can share in something that's presented with these concepts in mind. So maybe you guys can do that.
I have a question. How much do you think free will relates to immersion? Because you have the things on the silk screens, and you have DarkCon, and those two are different because in DarkCon you have the choice of going wherever you want versus the memory stairs where you're just observing. So how much do you think free will is important? Because nowadays, there's a lot of narrative games, and people are talking about how, or if they're really games, and whether or not they're cheating the player in terms of immersion or not.
It's a great question. I think my answer would have to say there's a range. There's a range. So some people, they say Second Life's not a game. Well, it's got games in it, it's got things you can do, but it may in the sense that it has a goal and it has, things that you're supposed to achieve and scores that you get to see where you are in that game. So I think just like you can have an IMAX film or a regular film, or you're watching it on your TV, or it's a sitcom, or it's a YouTube video, those are all just different types of media. And so I think there are different types of immersion, and we need to explore them all, because there are times, I'm not going to always want to put a head-mounted display on and sit somewhere, just like I'm not always going to want to sit at a desktop and do stuff. I might want to do something on my phone. I think augmented reality is another thing where you're superimposing these created elements over the physical world, which is another thing. So that's why I showed you the silk panels, which I don't usually show anybody, because it's a different kind of experience. And there wasn't a lot of free will there because I didn't have a lot of time, but I would have taken that entire soundstage and just blanketed it with these things, so you would have had to walk through it. And I probably would have made attractors and detractors. I probably would have made some coercive narrative so that you could do things there. And I could even see that being a multiplayer game or experience of some sort, or people making it out of that because that's what seemed to it said to them when they were in it. So, you know, I just think there's no possibility it shouldn't be explored. You may focus on something for a particular thing you're making, but you could, you know, the world's the limit.
One of the game proposals that I heard someone talking about was actually using the database of like Google Earth and people's photos to actually go into an existing world, even though it's not done in 3D properly. And someone had the idea of going to a location, and with the headset on, you were still in that location, but in an augmented reality way, you could step into someone's scanned photos of that world from the past. So you could, you know, you could be in a location, go to a location of a place, Google Earth, you're there, you know, it's all kind of a 2D feint, but there was a way to then access people's downloading of those pictures done from the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, maybe with them narrating over it, and then you get to kind of go into this web of time within a specific location. And I really like the idea of travel. How to make that happen, I want to see that happen, because that's the kind of stuff that I find very attractive. Fantastic. Any other questions?
Well, thanks
Thanks
for
again for coming, I appreciate it.
That was fun.